Welcome to the second talk in the Future of Architecture series. My name is Akil. I'm your host again. And today we are talking to Andreea Ion Cojocaru. And she is the founder and the CEO of NUMENA, a creative design firm that focuses in architecture and the virtual architecture of the world. So she's actually an award-winning architect who exists in both realms, the physical and the virtual. And today we're going to be talking a little bit more about virtual reality and its impact on architecture as a profession. I'm going to be asking some of the difficult questions as well as the ones that you probably didn't want to ask yourself, maybe just because you're kind of shy. So Andreea, thank you. Welcome on board. It's very nice to have you here. Thank you for making the time to be with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Akil. I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation.
Yes, actually, that's perhaps the most valuable part of any conversation, that is interesting and is insightful. So I'm going to ask you very quickly to tell me, before we actually start talking about how to grapple with virtual reality and what its effects are, tell me, you've been in the virtual reality / architecture space for a while. Can you just tell us how you got into VR and why?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been on the lookout for ways to combine technology with architecture for my entire architectural career.
Right.
And as some of you probably know, it wasn't as easy as it is now, let's say 10, 20 years ago, to combine these two things. Architecture used to be an extremely classical profession. You to get a job in an office and you just draw, you CAD things all day long. But I actually grew up learning how to code a little bit and doing some coding since I was very young with my father. And then basically in the year 2000, things like plugins started to show up. So you could use a little bit of coding knowledge to code a plugin for AutoCAD, for example.
Right.
But those tended to be used for very non-creative kind of tasks, right? They were used to automate things like counting how many windows or doors you have in your building. So it wasn't really what I wanted for, what I was interested in. I wanted to introduce programming into design at a conceptual level.
Right.
And for me, that became the answer to what could that look like became obvious when I first tried virtual reality. Because to produce a virtual reality application, you need knowledge of three-dimensional design and the ability to produce 3D models, which I had from being an architect. And you need to code behavior. So you need the player, the user of the VR experience and various elements in there to have certain behaviors, to move, to change. And for that, you need coding.
Right. Right. I think that the second part of what you're mentioning is something that people wouldn't have necessarily easily assumed, or perhaps if they did assume it, that seems to be a little bit difficult. And that's perhaps where there's some hesitancy, at least from architects and people interested in pursuing coding who are non-coders. I think maybe that's a part that's difficult to them. But tell me, if you've been drawn to virtual reality for a long time in your life, then what does virtual reality mean to you?
It means a new dimension of human activity. So for me, it goes way beyond being a tool that helps us design more interesting buildings or more efficient buildings. I see VR as bringing huge value in and of itself. As you're probably aware, there are a lot of companies right now, including my company, doing virtual applications where people actually meet and do things together in the virtual space without any connection to any type of physical space.
Right.
And the type of things you can do with your friends or with a group or with your company inside these virtual spaces go into the direction of simulations and very imaginative sci-fi kind of things that really change what we can do as either individuals or group of people or as a society. So for me, it's really a new dimension for human activity.
So I think that's actually a very insightful answer you've given. Before this chat, we actually spoke to students a little bit, and one of the very interesting perspectives one of the students had, which we'll get to after the session, is mentioning that virtual reality may be a new platform to experience reality. And he said that it's an experiential thing. The world is something that needs to be experienced. And if we look at architecture, this experience has been taken into account over the years, but not in its entirety. So the experience seemed to be, at least when architects mentioned it, they spoke about volumetric and quite objective things. Now, if we harken back to some of the architecture theory by Giovanni Pallasma and similar works, we see that these theories have been around for a while, and they've been shot down a number of times, but perhaps it has some prominence in this time. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. This is very interesting approach. So for those who don't know, Pallasma was an architectural theorist that really focused on the sensorial aspects of architecture. He wrote in the 60s and 70s, and I think also 80s. And during that time, architectural discourse was really dominated by ideas of functionalism, for example, and rationality. And Pallasma came with a completely new set of ideas on the stage of architectural discourse, and he focused on haptics, tactility, or the way a space smells, or the way color has an influence on us. And he was met by the architectural community with mixed reactions. Some welcomed this new approach away from this very strict rationality that used to govern our design decisions. But for some, it was just too much subjectivity, right? So discussing how a color makes us feel is extremely subjective, and many did not feel like this could be the grounds of a solid intellectual discourse. And it's very interesting how where we place virtual reality in this discourse, or not, right? And I would personally place it more in Pallasma's court, because VR allows us to create a shareable subjective experience, right? So of course, how something makes you feel is always going to be subjective. Some people are trying to create brain implants to hack that and try to figure out how to get it out of your head and analyze it. But until that's working, up and running, it's still subjective. But what VR does is it brings us a shareable experience. So I can create a virtual building, and I can send this application to all of you. So we've all had the same kind of immersive experience of what it feels like to walk through this building.
Right. I actually think that there's a lot of value in what you just mentioned about this common reality now that we're sharing, because before experience, or at least imagining a space, was just in our minds. If you're an architect, and you've got to find methods to get it out of your head. You've got to either draw it, or you've got to build models, and that's two primary methods that we use to communicate this message, the vehicles who drive it. And when the computer had made its appearance, we began to, in a sort of augmented space, or a digital space rather, model all of these objects. So now we had perspectives created and objects created in the digital world, but now we have something new. We have the spatial world, and I think that VR, as you mentioned, is an embodiment, and we did have this discussion before, is an embodiment. You can really embody these ideas that were in your mind, and now it's out of your mind, and everybody can see the same idea. So there's no misunderstanding. In fact, I think this would really have aided students, perhaps in many years of architecture, because students always say, well, the building should be like this, and this is where this is going to go. And sometimes it's not reflected in your plan. If we had something similar to that before, I think would have been quite valuable. Maybe we'll have it in future. Well, that's what these kind of discussions are about. So talking about maybe having it in the future, do you think that VR is starting to some extent measure and quantify subjectivity?
Oh, that's an interesting approach. I think we're going there. So to pick up on what you said earlier, a way to start to think about this. So the answer to your question is very difficult, and I don't think I have a fully formed answer for you right now. Okay. But I would like to at least present a way to start to think about it. And that has to do with what you said earlier, that we always as architects have a building in our heads. And the biggest challenge is how do we get that building out so we can communicate it to other people. Right. And we can think of that in terms of a history of what we call abstraction and representation. Wow. So 2D drawing or sketching or 2D drawing in AutoCAD, it's an abstraction, right? It's not the building itself. It's an abstraction that communicates certain kind of information. And that's what we call representation. Correct. When we started to get in the 90s, software that allows us to do 3D modeling, now this abstraction got a third dimension. It wasn't just XY, it was XYZ, but it was still a representation and it was still an abstraction. It was because it wasn't the actual building, right? There was still some distance, but this distance between the actual building and the representation got a bit shorter, right? Because we know the real building, let's say, has three spatial dimensions, X, Y, Z, and it has a temporal dimension, the fourth dimension, which is time. So we had hand drawing, 2 dimensions, CAD drafting, also 2 dimension, 3D modeling, we added a third dimension. So we're making some progress. And now VR adds the fourth one, right? Because you can walk through the virtual building in time. So you see how you react as time flows. So we've added 4 dimension now. So the virtual building is still not the real building. Of course, it's still not. So it's still a representation, but it's getting closer and closer to the real building.
So how close or far do you think we are? Because it seems as though we've been going down levels of abstraction now. We're getting closer to perhaps to the source. Do you think that there's a haptic experience that's coming along on board, or a tactile, or extra sensory experiences that may be coming?
Yes. So what are we missing now in VR? Like why isn't the virtual building the real building? The obvious, well, the obvious answer is because it does not have materials. The real building has materials. So what is so special about materials, aside from the fact that, you know, it protects us from rain and snow? Well, materials have tactility and they have resistance. So if you've ever been in a VR application, you will see that if you put your hand through a wall, your hand will go through the wall, whereas in reality, that will not happen. So it has physical resistance. And there are many companies right now working on what's called haptic gloves and haptic suits, where there is, for example, what's a haptic glove? It's a glove with an exoskeleton on the outside that actually creates an illusion of resistance. So when you are close to a wall, this exoskeleton on the haptic glove is preventing your fingers from actually doing this. It's stopping at the wall. So we're making progress in also adding what we could call the 5th dimension, I guess, which is this illusion of resistance and haptics to it.
So now that we're getting so close on this scale of abstractions to the source, and we could almost create something real, would you say it's necessary to create something that's exactly a replica of the real world?
Well, yeah, this is exactly where the fun begins, right? So if we could have a building that is so complete in giving us all of these dimensions and this feedback and this sensorial impressions, do we need the real building? Then why should we spend the millions of bucks buying materials and building the real building? Of course, there's some sarcasm in what I'm saying, because to some extent we still need houses and buildings, but it's something worth discussing, right? Because technology has took us to this point, and we see these type of paradoxes. For example, if you think about how do human beings interact with each other, that has always happened in a physical space, right? Before what we call the information society, we have always met and talked and done every single imaginable physical activity in a physical space.
That's right.
When the informational society came about, and it came about with the rise of cybernetics in the 50s and 60s, and then now we are in a situation where most of our human activity does not happen necessarily in a physical space, It actually happens over the internet, and especially now with the pandemic.
Yeah.
So in a way, architecture is already a little bit in a crisis. It's already confronted with these very interesting twists and turns of modern society. As architects, we used to worry about designing school buildings and universities, and we used to spend months running studies on how far away should the chairs be and how many seats can we get in a university auditorium. I used to work for academic buildings for several years in New York, and that was my entire life. And all of a sudden, all that knowledge and all those years I spent with those kind of questions are not relevant anymore. And this wasn't even that long ago. This was maybe 6-7 years ago. So all of a sudden, that type of knowledge is obsolete. No one is hiring an architect anymore to figure out how many seats to fit in an auditorium.
That's quite true. In fact, I think perhaps in what you just mentioned is where the crisis comes in. And I think we'll touch on some of the crisis in the next question. But in order to make that bridge across to the question about the crisis and perhaps the economic perception and value as well of an architect, I think virtual reality, and you mentioned yesterday, talks a little bit more to cognitive science and proprioception. Now, if we can perhaps bring some value into this virtual reality and make it a new skill set for architects, perhaps maybe architects might not fear becoming obsolete as much as they fear it now. Do you think there's any value in investigating VR as an alternative career path, perhaps, for architects?
So I wouldn't call it alternative career path. I would encourage people to see it as a new set of skills that they are adding to what they already have. But as to the fear of your skills becoming obsolete, I think we do not talk enough about that as a profession. I feel like we should engage with the students a lot more, because I'll give you an example. My father is an engineer, and I talk all the time about how he spent his entire career dealing with almost the entire set of issues because progress was so slow in that time. But now we live in a time where every 10 years we have to completely almost relearn something that has to do with our profession. But I never thought before the pandemic that this would even apply to me, that even what I learned within less than 10 years would become useless. So I don't have anything to say that would make students feel better. The situation is quite dire. We should be worried, and as people involved in, to some extent, in teaching, we should have this conversation with students, and we should be planning much better what is our approach, because students are going through very difficult university years that in some countries even cost a lot of money, and they're absolutely facing a situation where 4 years down the road or even 2 years down the road, everything just changes, and all of a sudden they're asked not only to use different kind of software, but they're asked to even design totally different things or in totally different ways. So it's a very important question.
Thanks for bringing the prominence to that, because I think as a field, honestly, those kind of questions about the relevance of architecture, if architecture doesn't adapt in time, it may become one of those things that is obsolete. And everyone who is on board as an architect is going to face that challenge, because there isn't almost like a sister field that we could go to. So now that we've just touched a little bit on that, I want to bring it towards virtual reality as something that can benefit us as architects. So now that through virtual reality, there's somewhat of a possibility of measuring subjectivity, similar to what Plasma has mentioned in his phenomenological theory. We now have evidence to say, you know what, perhaps there's more to VR than just it being a gimmick or a tool or some sort of virtual representation. But then that begs the question, if VR can produce evidence, what can an architect use VR for, which can't be achieved in any other way?
I want to answer this from the perspective of the experiences that we've had as a company in between traditional architecture and software development for VR.
That's great. That's great.
We have seen that it's actually clients who are driving this change. This change is not coming from architects. We've had clients come to us that already had hired another architecture company to design their building and said, I am spending huge amounts of money for this building. My company is investing huge amounts of money in this. And before we build it, I want to make sure I like everything about it. And I cannot check that by looking at drawings or at the 2 or 3 renderings that my architect is giving me. I want to be able to walk and check every corner, every door, every window of this building before I'm pouring in millions of bucks into it. So architects, the feedback that we've been getting for clients is that first, of course, they went to their own architects and they said, hey, there's this new technology. Can you put my building into it before we start building it? And the architects usually say no. They usually say, no, this is technology, this is a fad, this is going to go away. We don't want to get involved with this. The architects are rejecting it. And then the clients come to us. So it's a lot of architects like this idea of the architect being a bit of a lone genius that spends time with their crazy sketches and doesn't really involve other people and creates this beautiful object that is an architectural masterpiece. And that's it. And then you should just build it. Like you shouldn't question what the artist has done. So they don't like the idea sometimes, not all of them, but a lot of them don't like the idea of VR showing clients everything, every corner, and allowing clients to ask more questions. They feel like they're losing a bit control of this. But clients need that. Clients need a way to get in the head of the genius architect to have more confidence in spending the money, because we are living through difficult financial times. So it's actually very interesting, right? Because we were not seeing this with other pieces of technology. It was architects who chose to adopt CAD, computer-aided design, and software. So it's usually architects who make this decision. But in this case, it's quite interesting to see it coming as a pressure on architects from clients.
So would you say then that this makes the client almost like an active citizen architect? Perhaps they could become an architect in their own regard. Does this mean, like you're saying, architects are actually losing control? So then if the client can now almost embody this perception, because really with virtual reality, what you're doing is whatever is in your mind as an architect, you are creating it in a space that everybody can see now. So that removes some of the genius mystery that's there. And now that everyone can see it, do you think then that people should have the right to design their own spaces?
Absolutely. And I absolutely believe architects are losing control. They're fighting against it right now. I think they will lose the battle. I think the only way forward is to embrace what's happening. And we as architects have to sit down and have discussions like this and figure out what the heck are we going to do, because that is exactly what VR is doing. So architecture is full of conventions, right? You go through these 4 years of university, and you spend a good portion of that time learning conventions, learning how to read plans, learning what a little triangle with a pointed arrow down means, if it's empty or black. But with VR, these conventions are the entry barrier. These conventions is what's making it hard for someone who's not an architect to read plans. Like they don't know what a dash line is. What is a dash line? What is line dot line dot? They don't know. But in VR, they don't need these conventions. They don't need symbolism. They don't need these levels of abstractions, they can just see it.
Yes,
so
it's
this
there,
completely opens up the way for people without an architectural education to start making very good informed architectural decisions.
That's right. That's quite true. Now you've also mentioned this quite a few times in previous talks you've done, that this is making architecture accessible to the, for lack of a better word, a layman. Anyone could perhaps design their own architecture. So then what do you think the role of architectural education would be in this light?
I think this means for me, and we can have a discussion about this because I can imagine many different viewpoints that I feel are equally valid. But my particular viewpoint on this right now is that we need to introduce critical thinking into all architecture education. If you look at the way architecture education is structured in the US, for example, because that's what I'm familiar with, you have the top tier universities that are, you know, the Ivies and the expensive private schools that have a big part of their curriculum dedicated to critical thinking. Okay. So when you go to these programs, you have to learn about sociology, you have to learn anthropology, you have to learn economics. But a lot of the lower tier programs do not deal with critical thinking. They're only based on the idea of let's teach them skills. Let's make sure they know how to use CAD and Revit so then they can get a job. But in this situation right now, maybe that's not enough anymore. Maybe even knowing how to be the best at Revit is not going to guarantee that you're going to get a job, because things are changing so fast. And they're changing also in this conceptual level. So the only thing I can think of right now on the spot is we have to somehow teach architects to engage in social discourse and to start to understand what's going on with the world, so they can feel as fear, so they can feel at least that they know how to make decisions, and they choose, they can make some, they can see some kind of path. They're not completely blinded, because I see a lot of people sometimes writing me and saying, what should I learn? Which programming language should I learn? Which software thing should I learn? What is the future, right? What is the future of architecture? And most of the time, I do not have an answer. I do not have an answer for them. And then what do I do? What do we do with these students that are very young? They don't know which way to go, and we cannot give them an answer because sometimes there is no clear answer.
That's what you said, I think hits a nerve on all architectural educators or lecturers, as well as students, because it is this lack of critical thinking that has existed in the curriculum for so long that I believe to some extent has maybe paralyzed the profession from actually moving in a more progressive direction. And so with that said, how do you think now that students and architects should actually grapple with new technologies? Let's say VR and perhaps the umbrella. How should we actually be approaching technology? Any kind of technology, whatever it is. What do you think, in your opinion, we should do?
So I have an answer that it's not popular. It's a bit like discussions about weight loss, you know, it's like don't eat sugar, right? But like no one wants to hear the fact that they shouldn't eat sugar. So my answer is learn how to code.
Learn how to code. What an excellent and succinct answer. It's a very, very straightforward, way to the point. And I think that's important, because I think as well that being able to program or to code, as it's mentioned, it does develop a sense of computational thinking as well as algorithmic thinking. And it does allow you to develop a new skill set, because it's not so much so that you are becoming a computer, but really the computer has learned its logic from you. We are the ones that develop the mode of thinking of the computer. And if this can compute information a lot more efficiently than us, so we need to also question what our role as human beings are in this interaction between the computer and human beings. There would be things that are tangible and intangible that we can start discussing perhaps in the question and answer session. So I think perhaps now with all that is said, And as we move on to the 40-minute mark, I think we've got about 6 minutes left on the 40-minute mark. Tell me, what do you think is the future of architecture, and how do you think it can be achieved? And I know it's a broad question, but in your opinion and in your expertise, what do you think the future of architecture is about?
Okay, this is a very difficult question. And I'm not sure I can give a satisfactory answer. I think it might be a future that is so different than the current situation that we will struggle for a while to imagine it.
Okay.
I myself am struggling right now to imagine it, because I feel like it will take us into a direction that is just very, very different. And one we've touched upon in the very beginning of discussion, one of these possible directions, which is the fact that architecture might split into two, which is architecture that is designing and building real physical buildings, and that will be focused mostly on construction techniques and the science of materials. And the second part of architecture, which might not even be called architecture, because at this point, I'm not sure I want to call it architecture, will be the design of completely physical environments that are never meant to be built. So there's a lot of discussion right now about what in technology is called spatial computing, right? So it's the new wave of the information technology, the spatial computing. So Facebook is going very strong. They have just launched a few months ago what's called Horizon. They want to take the entire ecosystem of what's going on in Facebook with all these human interactions into spatial computing, so that you don't chat with your friends and have whatever you're doing on your timeline now on Facebook, but you're doing that in a virtual design, three-dimensional environment.
Right.
So what are we going to do if we split like that? I don't know, but there are definitely some crazy things ahead of us.
I think I've also had seen insight to that, and the spatial web, and things that are somewhat so far-fetched. You can either go with the change or be so afraid you maybe stop yourself. Andreea, thank you very much for your time today and for your insight. I think we'll take a 5-minute break here, so that we can, if anyone wants to get water or something, eat quickly, and we'll rejoin again in the next 5 minutes to start a question and answer session, because the questions that I heard from the students earlier on are very interesting ones, and I think they are teeming with excitement to try and ask them to you. So Andreea, thank you very much for joining, and thank you for your insight and imparting the wisdom that only experience and critical thought can bring. I truly appreciate it.
You're welcome, and I'll see you in 5 minutes.
I'll see you in 5 minutes.